Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. When it comes to pro-Palestinian activism, are the rights to free speech, free thought, and free assembly under attack? Let's get to the bottom line. For almost a year, pro-Palestine activists have been raising their voice to demand a ceasefire to the war in Gaza, calling for sanctions against Israel and freedom for the Palestinians. Also since then, demonstrations have been met with force, and protesters have been prosecuted. Students have been suspended from their universities, and folks have been fired by their employers for speaking up. So are we witnessing a crackdown on free speech and assembly that's not just affecting students and not just happening in the United States? Is this creating a chilling effect on free debate on Palestine and Israel? And is the war on Gaza sparking a further erosion of civil rights in many Western countries? Today we're talking with Richard Medhurst, a British journalist who was detained last month under the UK Terrorism Act, and Dima Khalidi, founder and director at Palestine Legal, which works to defend Americans experiencing reprisals for advocating for Palestine, and has published several reports on the issue, including the Palestine exception to free speech. Thank you both for joining me today. This is a topic I care deeply about. I hate censorship, but I see it everywhere right now. Richard, I'm often going in and out of London Heathrow Airport. I'm often commenting on these issues, but you went through an incredible experience. Tell us about it.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. And yeah, incredible is certainly one way of putting it. They not only detained me, but arrested me. And I'm the first journalist in Britain to have to be arrested under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act. And it's specifically Section 12(1)(a). So if you read the legislation, it's extremely broadly defined, very abstract, casts a very wide net. So you know that these are the dangers that many of us were warned about years ago. Whether it's Schedule 7, where you know you're detained for questioning and you have to answer every question, or Section 12. I think they're trying to make an example out of me, and it felt very, very you know, over the top. I mean, they sent 6 police officers and handcuffed me and took all of my equipment. I'm not just talking about my phones, which is bad enough. They took all of my journalistic tools, you know, my microphones, wired and wireless, headphones. Just, you know, it felt so unnecessary. And they kept me in custody for almost 24 hours in, frankly, abysmal conditions. I mean, it was more like a dungeon than a cell. And you're being recorded the whole time. So, you know, you feel the crushing power of the state. You feel how over the top it is, and it's designed to be intimidating and humiliating. And I think that the people who ordered this arrest, they certainly would hope that this would discourage others from speaking about Palestine, because ultimately that is what I was arrested for. It was for my reporting and nothing more. And they're trying to make basic journalism out to be, you know, something sinister and very, very sinister. You know, this is for all intents and purposes, akin to a political persecution. And I covered Julian Assange's case, and I know how these things work. And this is in a different direction, but it bears some resemblance in some manners.
Well, let's take it, you know, a further step. I don't see, and I'd love to know from you, did they underline a sentence that you said? Did they underline a paper or a news article or a video that you produced and said, you have so crossed the line with what is legally acceptable and where we're classifying as terrorism? Did that ever happen?
Well, I was questioned by 2 detectives, and you know, I'm not at liberty, legally speaking, to go into what they asked specifically, but it is about my reporting. So, you know, it's basically things to do with Palestine. And again, the problem with this is that they've sort of put me in limbo now, because I was released unconditionally on bail, and some lawyers, it's their opinion that this was done on purpose, because now I don't know what I can and cannot say. And I believe that, like I said, because I'm the first journalist to be arrested under Section 12, they're trying out a test case. They're trying to see how much they can get away with. And the same week, they went after activists as well, you know, Palestine Action and Sarah Wilkinson. So it's definitely a crackdown. You could certainly describe it as such. And, you know, I think it's just horrific that you would do this to anyone, but especially in a democracy where you're supposed to have the right to report freely as a journalist. I feel like my right to exercise my journalistic freedoms, they've been taken away completely. I don't know what I can and cannot say, and I feel like there's a target on my back. So, yeah.
Dima, I'd love to ask you to give us a snapshot of what's happening more broadly, particularly in America. And I want to ask you, what is the state of the constitutional protection of freedom of speech in the United States when it comes to those that have been commenting and concerned and activists about Palestine and the Gaza crisis right now?
Yeah, we are in a dire period. There's no doubt about it. And it's not new. I think that's really important to remember. We've been at Palestine Legal documenting for years an attack on people who speak out for Palestinian rights. We've called it a Palestine exception to free speech, where in the US we have very strong constitutional protections for free expression. There seems to be this exception when it comes to Palestine. And that's for a number of reasons. It is one of the issues that people in this country can't dissent on because there is such a complete bipartisan consensus that we're starting to see cracks in, but there is still a bipartisan consensus for unconditional support for Israel. I think it's also important to contextualize what's happening to the movement for Palestinian rights in a broader context of what period we're in generally. There is a far-right resurgence across the country and across the globe. And the result of that is a serious crackdown on constitutional and human rights everywhere. So in this country, it's not just attacking dissent on Palestine. We also are seeing a massive effort to crack down on the movement for Black lives, on indigenous and environmental justice movements. There is legislation being passed across the board that is undermining constitutional protections for free speech and assembly and association. We're seeing activists being targeted with criminal prosecutions, with lawsuits by corporations or Israel lobby groups that is attacking them for their advocacy and their organizing on a grassroots level. And as I said, elected officials are at the forefront of introducing legislation in the context of the Palestine movement that is fundamentally anti-Palestinian. There's no doubt that we're seeing echoing Israel's own genocidal language, anti-Palestinian language and rhetoric and actions. We're seeing our own elected officials mirroring that kind of dehumanizing rhetoric and also introducing legislation that, for example, calls for the deportation of all Palestinians. And, similar to Richard's experience, we are also seeing the weaponization of not only anti-terrorism laws, but also accusations of anti-Semitism that are targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights, that are claiming that anti-Zionism, criticism of Zionism, the political ideology, and the state of Israel are equivalent to anti-Semitism. So there is a widespread crackdown that we're seeing that isn't new, that has been the culmination of years and even decades of repression of the Palestine movement, as well as other movements.
Right. NYU, I should note, has just made Zionism a protected class at their university, which is very interesting because oftentimes protected class is gender or sexual identity or ethnic identity. This is a very different dimension of a protected class. Would love to get your thoughts. But more deeply, as you just said, the accusations or calls of people as anti-Semites who are engaged in what I would call absolutely protected speech and absolutely protected protest and labeling them racist. Do you see models out there, Dima, of institutions that are getting it right for the most part?
Unfortunately, I think there are very few that are getting it right, and institutions like Columbia are setting the standard for universities calling the police to brutalize and arrest their own students and professors and others, and also, instituting draconian sanctions on students, expelling, suspending, barring them from their own housing and food services. So that has really set the standard in a lot of ways for the ways universities are responding. We are seeing some universities saying, we're not going to comment on anything. We're not taking any kinds of stands whatsoever. And that's the other side of the coin. But we have seen a couple of examples of universities actually responding to students' demands to stop using their tuition dollars to invest in the military-industrial complex, to invest in this genocide against the Palestinian people and war and militarism. Unfortunately, there have only been a couple of universities that have taken these positions where they are actually responding to their students and engaging what they are asking for. And in other situations, again, universities have followed the lead and followed the demands of pro-Israel groups and of elected officials to really crack down on protesters, unfortunately.
Thank you, Richard. I want to ask you about the general ecosystem of news out there when it comes to this Israel-Palestine conflict, which has now been going on far, far longer than most predicted. And I have to be honest that it rises and falls in the media, and it usually rises when, in reaction to a shock. I remember before Jose Andres' World Central Kitchen staff were killed, Israel-Palestine had largely fallen off the map of front U.S. pages. This show has been focused on this really throughout the crisis. What are your observations as you talk to media and journalists around there? Are you finding editors trying to squelch this story? And I just basically say, do you think as media and journalists, we are as dedicated to this story as we should be?
I think for the most part, most journalists and outlets are they're sort of half covering the issue. And what do I mean by that? When they cover it, if they do, they of course toe the usual Israeli line, and the other half just simply don't cover it at all. I mean, for example, if you go through public transport in Germany or Austria or whatever, they'll have these like TV screens up there, and sometimes you literally do not see Palestine mentioned whatsoever. So it's not even that they're showing it and then giving you, the Israeli perspective on what is happening. It's just not mentioned, which really shocked me, because it's the biggest news story in the world. I mean, how can you just not talk about it and act like it's not happening? So I think most outlets are not doing their due diligence, and they're shirking their responsibilities. They've abdicated their duties as journalists. I mean, we can take the example of the hostages, for example, the 6 Israeli hostages that were found dead a few days ago. The British media, US media, they put up their photographs, they put up their names and everything, and they do the same all across Europe in French and in German. And then when it comes to the Palestinian victims, there's nowhere near the same level of humanization. So, again, it's like they'll talk about victims only when they're Israeli or when they happen to be Western victims or aid workers, but the Palestinians receive nowhere near the same kind of humanization, and it is really, really shocking. If gang rape, for example, at State Ayman, was covered better by Israeli media than the media in Britain or in the United States, which shocked me, because you would think that foreign media would perhaps, hold these soldiers more to account. But ironically, it ended up being Israeli media. So we are living through very, very strange times. But on the whole, most journalists and outlets are certainly abdicating their duties to inform the public.
But Dima, I want to talk to you because I don't want to get into question of what's morally equivalent or unequivalent. But people are really paying with their jobs, they're paying with their reputations, et cetera, if they're standing up for something that they care about. In the United States, this is allegedly a protected act by the United States Constitution. Do you see the ACLU or do you see any of the institutions that typically stand up for those trying to stand in front of the tank and say, look, I see things differently and these are my rights? Are there any movements now from a legal perspective within U.S. courts beginning to turn some of this around for those victims of the bandwagoning and what you call, your institute is called the McCarthyite spread of, repression against those that have been concerned about Palestine?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think what we are seeing right now is not just this unprecedented crackdown, but really since October 7th and before October 7th, just an enormous wave of solidarity with Palestinians. And, not only the unprecedented marches in the streets around the world, but, when we see our governments doing nothing in response to majorities of people wanting a ceasefire, wanting an end to U.S. Arms to Israel, new and creative tactics to really disrupt business as usual, right? Note as well that not only is there an unprecedented crackdown, but unprecedented solidarity and mobilization to end this genocide and for freedom for Palestinians. And that includes the legal community. Since October 7th, we've had really a tsunami of people, and we've had hundreds of lawyers calling us up to volunteer their time. So that includes organizations across the country that work on civil rights and civil liberties issues. And we are challenging these kinds of excesses, this repression in courts, in government agencies. The reality is that Palestinians in Palestine are not safe. They are under constant attack. They are being killed and starved and dying from disease as we speak. And people here understand the moral obligation to stand up, even if it means risking, our careers, our reputations, being slapped with frivolous lawsuits, et cetera. And I think that's really critical here. And what we have to understand is that there is safety in numbers. And as long as we stand up and fight back and challenge these efforts to undermine constitutional rights, against discriminatory enforcement of regulations at universities, against discriminatory employment decisions, we're going to ultimately prevail. As with all movements, I think it takes time. Yeah. Right? We didn't see court victories against segregation for years and years. We didn't see the upholding of First Amendment rights against McCarthyist purges for years after that. So the wheels of justice turn slowly. Right. But ultimately, I think we'll see, and history will prove us correct here.
Thank you, Richard. Is it your sense that this situation in Europe and in democratic societies is possibly going to tilt in a better direction, or are you worried about the repression and censorship becoming far worse?
Oh, it's definitely getting worse. And I know people like to throw around the F word a lot, and I mean fascism in this case. But I do not say this lightly when I say that we are witnessing fascism or the materialization of fascism. And again, it's not just about me, it's also about the others that were targeted with Section 12 within the same week, albeit activists, but nevertheless targeted and in really harsh ways. And moreover, I'd also point to, for example, the case of Mary Kostakidis in Australia, who is facing a charge of alleged anti-Semitism for things that don't even contain opinion in them, right? For tweeting or retweeting things that literally have no opinion in them whatsoever. They're just journalism in its most basic form, quotes. They're trying to criminalize the most basic function of a journalist, which is to critique the government, to report news, to gather news, to collate information, and also to combat any form of potent activism, be it people who go on marches, people who work in, help people in Gaza with charity work, or who perhaps engage in more direct action. So at least for Britain, I can 100% confirm it is unfortunately getting worse. And we're seeing the erosion, the destruction of our civil liberties, of rights that we've taken for granted for decades, if not centuries. And again, this is no way for any country to behave. It really isn't. I know that the Labour government have said they will withdraw 30 out of 350 arms exports licenses. For example, they've also withdrawn their challenge to the ICC's jurisdiction in Palestine. But these are, these are empty gestures. At the end of the day, they've actually gone and singled out people that the Israelis find problematic. Now, I don't know if they've done it with the Israelis or on their behalf, but they have singled out people who have large platforms and who are doing effective work, and they're trying to make examples out of us. And that is not healthy in any society, especially not one that calls itself democratic.
Dima, thank you very much. Dima, I'm going to ask you just in quick closing, just a quick comment. I'm just interested in the sort of state of law today. When you have the World Court that's told Israel that the occupation of Gaza and East Jerusalem and et cetera is illegal, and you kind of look at this long-term ignoring of norms, rules, laws that are out there that are in clear, you've got clear violations. I mean, I guess coming back to what Richard just said, what should those victims, students, employees, journalists that are out there engaged in this fight who find themselves all of a sudden discriminating, what do they do? What do they outreach?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think it's critical that we continue to challenge all of the repression that is happening, and to connect it to broader efforts, as Richard said, of this resurgence of fascism. This is not just going to impact Palestinians and allies and people who speak out for Palestinian rights. It's going to impact journalists like Richard. It's going to impact people who are dissenting on other issues, ultimately, if we leave it to the state and to the powers that represent the status quo to dictate what is okay to say, what is okay to report, what is okay to teach in our classrooms. So the stakes are really high, and it requires the mobilization of every profession. Right, not just lawyers challenging this in court, because the courts won't save us either. But at universities, unions are critical. In workplaces, getting the support of your colleagues and getting unions to back you and support you. They've played a critical role in pushing back. We do have safety in numbers, and we have to challenge every aspect of this repression.
Well, listen, I want to thank you both. Dima Khalidi, founder and director of Palestine Legal, and independent journalist Richard Medhurst. Amazing story that you've shared with us. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? In the U.S., talking about anything sensitive, where there are winners and there are losers, and where there is bias and there is misunderstanding, has become complicated and more personally dangerous for people trying to break through the orthodoxy or conventional framing of many crucial topics. One of those crucial topics is definitely anything related to Palestine. And the same problem applies to the way we talk about race in America, especially after the murder of George Floyd. Now we are seeing those trying to raise their voice in support of Palestinian rights and justice slandered as racist themselves. Guess what? There is no fix to this. It's been happening this way from the dawn of American history. People have been canceled for centuries. But somehow, over time, we actually get to a better place. It's only a matter of time. The only question is, when will the U.S. get to a better place on Palestine and Palestinian rights? Because there is just no system big enough to silence all the voices who care. And that's the bottom line.